Good morning. Today is Thursday, 11th of July 2024, and I'm going to talk a bit about action achieves more than words. Action is more powerful than words. One of the principles, I believe, of John Wesley. And the church has actually done some amazing things, really good things in the past, which we sometimes need to remember. I mean, the abolition of the slave trade was primarily motivated by strong Christians. William Wilberforce, who apparently was a very young-looking person, he had an exceptionally young appearance, but he persevered in Parliament for years and years and years to get this act to rescind slavery passed. But he also had a whole series of other Anglican reformers, and they were in Clapham in London, where he worshipped, and they were called the Clapham Saints, who were fervently supporting him. And of course, not least of all, there was John Newton, who was actually very involved. And what an extraordinary achievement at the cost of huge sums of money, because we do forget that slavery, as abhorrent as it is now, was a completely legitimate business, and there were vast sums of money involved. Towns that we now know well wouldn't have existed. Major banks that we know actually probably wouldn't have existed. Yet they got there in the end. And in 1807, the Abolition of Slavery Act was passed, and then the plantation slavery was banned in 1833. And it was an extraordinary thing to do. I mean, I reckon that the British Navy spent something like, in today's money, it would be equivalent to about 17 billion pounds policing that. You know, it wasn't just words; they actually did enforce it. So, very remarkable people. But there's another slave trade which is often forgotten about, that I know a bit about, having been brought up in Africa, and that's on the East African slave trade and the Arab slave trade, which is actually sometimes forgotten, that the Arab slave trade, which went on for 1,300 years, actually took more people away from their homes than the Atlantic slave trade. About 20 million people, whereas the Atlantic slave trade was about 12.5 million. This went on a very, very long time. In fact, it wasn't banned in Saudi Arabia until 1962, after a lot of pressure again. But in Zanzibar, which I went to first when I was 4, and again when I think I was 51, they had the Omani slave trade, which was actually very, very horrible, and every single slave was flogged until they dropped, and they would actually value them according to their toughness. A very cruel business, and it's really quite moving if you go there. Disturbing. But the British were very against this, because slavery was still carrying on, but it was a protectorate. They were also respectful of a different culture, because it was the Sultan of Oman actually lived in the palace in Stone Town in Zanzibar. But when then there were huge moves to get the slavery stopped there, and the British actually decided that the new Sultan who was going to take over, who was very pro-slavery and wanted to promote it further, they weren't going to have him, and it resulted in the shortest war ever known in history, whereupon an ultimatum was for him to withdraw as being the Sultan, or they would open fire at 9 o'clock in the morning, and they did. On the palace where the Sultan was supposed to be, and the whole thing was over and done in about 40 minutes, and they surrendered, and slavery was then finished in Zanzibar in 1856, which is actually again a very strong Christian movement. When you go there, where that whipping post was, where the poor slaves were whipped, is now on the altar in a church in Stone Town. A very poignant place to go. I think our history in the past is checkered, but we do sometimes rub it in that we've done all sorts of awful things, but we did an awful lot of good stuff as well. So Lord, let's take stock from this. Let's do our best to do what we can for reform and change when necessary, and to take the action necessary after prayer to do what is actually required for change. Amen. Have a lovely day.